Welcome to the Simple Sophisticate podcast, where intelligent living is paired with signature style. I'm your host, Shannon Ables. And whether you're listening on your commute, exercising, working in the garden, or sitting down with a hot cup of tea or a cafe au lait, thank you for tuning in. Let's get started. Welcome to the 162nd episode of the Simple Sophisticate. Today we're talking about happiness versus contentment, and I'm looking forward to getting into this topic, especially based on a few conversations I've had recently, because we're going to shift what we pursue. But before I get into that, I want to give a hint as to what today's petit plaisir is. It is something for your taste buds. At the farmers markets, all sorts of produce is coming in fresh and delicious. And this recipe is going to take one of those lovely vegetables and offer you a recipe that's so simple but so decadent and delicious. You will want to keep it in your summer capsule menu repertoire. So be sure to stay tuned at the end of today's episode when we'll talk about that. I also want to thank you for tuning into last week's episode, the 161st episode, the Ask Shannon episode. It was the first time we've ever done that, and it was the most downloaded episode of all time, 3 times over. And it was also the most downloaded in one day. So thank you very much for your interest, for tuning in, for sending your email questions. I know I didn't get to all of them, but I think we're going to have to do this again in the future. If last week's response was any indication as to your guys' interest. So definitely know that we'll be doing this as an annual event, maybe twice a year if that is what you guys want. And we get those questions. You can keep sending me your questions, by the way. Just send them to AskShannon@thesimplyluxuriouslife.com. All right, so let's get to today's topic. From seeking happiness to cultivating contentment, a shift in what we pursue. I want to begin with a quote from Paul Hudson, and he states, "Focusing on happiness as our ultimate goal is self-defeating. Being in a constant state of happiness is, simply put, impossible." If you place the word happiness on the cover of a self-help book, it will sell more times than it won't. In fact, did you know that Amazon has over 40,000 book titles with the word happiness on the cover? There's a reason for that. It sells. The concept of happiness has a mass following, as once we've experienced the feeling of our happy neurochemicals surging through our mind and being, we want more. And who wouldn't? However, as Paul Hudson also reminds, happiness is not a natural state. It's an elevated state. Since happiness is not a natural state that we are born at, however, we can attain it, as we all know, it's important to keep in mind that just as we can attain sadness, we are not born sad. It's not a natural state. The question is to determine what is the natural state we are born at. A couple of years ago, I shared Dr. E.P. Segelman's equation of what happiness consists of, and it consists of 3 parts. The first part is the set range based on your biological parents, so something you have absolutely no control over. That's a third of how happy you're going to be as an individual. The other 2 are circumstances of your life, meaning money, relationships, health, religion, etc. And the third one is voluntary factors that are under your control, how you deal with the past, how you think about the future, etc. Add those 3 things together, and that's what's going to determine your level of happiness. Now, based on the realization that we individually have a set range as the foundation, it is the other circumstances and voluntary actions that can heighten or depress the level of happiness we attain. You may be looking at this equation and thinking, well, I absolutely can be happy all the time if 2 of the primary components are in my control. But my question to you is, are they entirely in your control? Your circumstances and the voluntary factors are not entirely in your control. However, how you respond to them, how you manage them, how you navigate the events, people, and setbacks is in your control. Therefore, it is how you navigate. It is the place from which you approach your circumstances, change them as you can, and how you change them that will either heighten the chances of moments of happiness or decrease. When we look closely at the term happiness, the root hap, H-A-P, it is of the Old English origin that came to be used in the 12th century. Its definition was, quote, one's luck or lot, and an occurrence happening or accident, end quote. I understand that words evolve and change and shift according, quite simply, to their use and context. After all, when Thomas Jefferson and his crew in the late 18th century added the pursuit of happiness as an inalienable right for all Americans, the word's meaning shifted significantly. It became about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. It became about me, not others, society, and community. Gone was the understanding that Aristotle believed that happiness was the byproduct of a life of virtue. Even Helen Keller recognized that our perspective on happiness in the 20th century was a little off. She states, many persons have a wrong idea of what constitutes true happiness. It is not attained through self-gratification, but through fidelity to a worthy purpose. It's important to point out that simply having the time and ability to think about what makes one happy and then cultivating a life more attractive to moments of happiness is a sign of significant prosperity. And since you are reading this post, that in of itself is something to celebrate. But now the important part is to shift how you go about experiencing happiness. Here's a quote from cognitive psychologist Rick Hanson, who wrote the book Hardwiring Happiness. In fact, I'm reading the book right now, and this is my first nugget that I want to share, but I know there's going to be many more. Here it is. There's a certain tendency in our culture to want to graft some kind of happiness onto an existing structure. If you just fill in the blank, get this car, find the right shade of lipstick, go on vacation in Mexico, lose those 5 pounds, suddenly you'll be happier and have the fulfillment you want in life. Let's be clear. The main happiness industry in America is the advertising industry, end quote. I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to challenge you to not fall into the trap psychologist Rick Hanson points out in this quote. Do not let the outside world, the marketing world, tell you what it takes to attain happiness. Rather, take a list of the 8 items I'm going to share with you here in a moment and discover how to make the shift in your daily life from seeking happiness to cultivating a life of contentment. In other words, letting go of what's outside of your control, because happiness is dependent on external factors. Yes, it has to come and bounce into your life, right? But it still has to come into your life, so therefore it's outside. But contentment is something you can cultivate within yourself and therefore experience it every single day. So number 1 is shift your perspective on challenging situations. In other words, see it as an opportunity to grow, learn, and not get stumped by. It's completely understandable if you become frustrated, but to turn that frustration into something that's not going to help you, and in fact is going to stress out those people around you based on how you don't deal with it, is not going to build a life of contentment. It's not going to bring contentment in those days. And then moving forward, absolutely not either. But how you handle it, if you handle it well, will not only help yourself out, but you're going to bring comfort and ease to those around you based on how you handle that situation. When they see you model that, they then are given keys to handling frustrating moments that they will have, and we will all inevitably have frustrating and challenging situations. Number 2, understand that fear of the unknown is a good sign. Now, on many of the points I'm going to talk about today, I've written in-depth posts or episodes of this podcast in previous months or years, and I've linked to those in the show notes, and this is an example of one of them. But simply put, if you are fearful of something, meaning it's an unknown and you're not sure how it's going to turn out, it means you're hopeful that it will. And that's a sign that you're going in a direction that you're curious or passionate about. If you don't care about the outcome, if it doesn't jazz you up, it's probably not something you're curious or passionate about. So use your fear of the unknown as a guide that you have a passion, a hope that something will work out. So again, you're shifting your perspective on how you handle these moments that could have been in the past detrimental to what you perceive to be happiness, when in fact it could be something that could bolster your contentment in the everyday and thus increase the potential for more happy moments down the road. Number 3, not being happy doesn't mean you are sad. The expectation of constant happiness gets in the way of learning how to feel and exist with these other emotions that are not all the opposite of happy. We can be curious, we can be interested, we can be ambivalent, neutral, focused, challenged, and I am just barely scratching the surface of potential emotions you could have. I provide a link of a list of over 100 different emotions, hundreds, I should just say. And why I'm going to share that with you, I think, is very important. Just as it's important to have a varied vocabulary in whatever language you have to use in your day-to-day communications, it's important to have a vast vocabulary when it comes to knowledge of emotions, because they're more precise and they're going to help you really pinpoint how you are feeling. And if you know accurately how you're feeling, then you're going to help yourself out to understand potentially the why, but also how to feel it, move through it, and move forward. Your job, whenever you're feeling something, is to identify what you're feeling. And while sometimes we may be able to explain the why, we don't actually have to know the root all the time. Simply identifying it accurately is going to help you out tremendously, because you're not going to feel lost or confused. Simply knowing what we are feeling and letting ourselves feel that particular emotion is a very healthy skill, which leads me to point number 4. It's important for us to build a life of wholeness rather than a life seeking constant happiness. Here's a quote from Australian social researcher Hugh Mackay. We're kind of teaching our kids that happiness is the default position. It's rubbish. Wholeness is what we ought to be striving for, and part of that is sadness, disappointment, frustration, failure, all of those things which make us who we are. Happiness and victory and fulfillment are nice little things that also happen to us, but they don't teach us much. I'd like just for a year to have a moratorium on the word happiness and to replace it with the word wholeness. Ask yourself, is this contributing to my wholeness? And if you're having a bad day, it is. End quote. A life of wholeness, as pointed out in his quote, will involve from time to time sadness. To feel sadness is to have known love, joy, tranquility, and yes, happiness. It is how you navigate through these daily occurrences. And when you know how to navigate, much like driving a car or navigating the subway or airline travel, you empower yourself to arrive successfully at your destination. So again, knowing what you're feeling, that is imperative. That's developing that wholeness rather than a constant state of happiness. Number 5, choose to handle negative situations in a productive way. Similar to number 1, how you handle challenging moments is going to either build or squash your ability to be content every single day. So when you handle negative situations well, you're going to build your resilience and your persistence, thus building your opportunity to experience happiness when opportunities come along that require you to be resilient and persistent in attaining them. Simple equation, right? So that's number 5. Number 6, practice patience. Let go of the need for fast fixes. This is something I have had to work on as well. We don't want the obstacles we run up against to take long to fix. We want them to be fixed immediately. The dishwasher's broken, please fix it now. My tire's flat, oh, please get it fixed right now. We want things to be fixed immediately. But this is the thing. Most things are not going to be able to be fixed immediately if they're big things. There are obviously going to be some things that are fixed immediately. But if they can't be fixed immediately, it's how we handle that interim that's going to either build or squash our contentment in that moment and the contentment of those around us, to be very honest. It's not fun to be around people who are stressed out and nervous, anxious when things aren't working out the exact way that they want. So if you flip that on its head and you're acting that way, how much contentment are you bringing into the lives of those around you? Not a whole lot. So this is a practice. This is a skill. It's not something that's going to be easy immediately, because you don't want to be in that state of frustration when something's not working. No one wants to be in that moment, but we're going to be eventually. And how we handle them is going to determine the outcome in the long run, and also determine the type of relationships that we have the opportunity to hold on to and build. So number 6 is practice patience. Number 7 is practice mindfulness. Being mindful asks us to be present, which requires us to have the ability to be the captain of our mind. The more we practice being mindful, in other words, practice Knowing when our mind drifts, not necessarily stopping thinking, as we've talked about many times before, and I provide a link to in the show notes on how to meditate and why it's important and what it really is. It's not about not thinking. It's just about being aware of when you have control of your mind or when it's wandered off without your recognition, and then bringing it back to wherever you want to be brought back to. It's a skill. It's a muscle. It's not going to happen right away, but even just meditating 5 or 10 minutes a day. Start off with 10 minutes 5 days a week and give yourself a break on the weekends, because it does take work, but then it becomes a source of peace and tranquility. And when those moments happen, like we just talked to number 6, when they're not working the way you want immediately, you can find yourself grabbing onto that angst and saying, okay, this is what I'm feeling. This is why I'm feeling it in this moment, but there's something I can do. And so I'm going to just take a breath and focus on what I can. And that is being calm. That is being a problem solver, and then letting go of the outcome until the person who can help me arrives or has time for me in their schedule or whatever it might be. So number 7 is practice mindfulness. And the last one is improve self-awareness. And I have a detailed post about how to build self-awareness and the benefits of self-awareness. But in essence, it's knowing how you affect those around you with your actions and your words. It's knowing why you feel or do what you do. And that's, again, very simple, but so many people don't either know their power or their negative effects, so good or bad, on themselves and the people around them. And if they could figure out and notice and be observant of that, then they can shift, grow, learn, strengthen those skills that they need, and enhance the ones that are working well also. So again, check out the show notes on all of those for more detailed information of benefits and steps to building those skills that are going to help you make that shift from seeking happiness instead to cultivating contentment. The show notes are the simplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast 162. Now, our natural state needs to be content rather than happy, as we've been talking about. And once we realize and practice building and living a life of contentment, we broaden the opportunity for happiness to be experienced. I have written extensively about contentment here on the blog and on the podcast, and I've included a handful of these posts on the show notes. So be sure to take a look if that's something that interests you. I want to end on a quote from 2 marriage counselors, Ben and Janelle Novel. And they state, happiness is essentially an end result of some action we've taken. So we need to build that life of contentment. So much of our discontent is a misunderstanding of what constitutes happiness. Once we put it into its rightful place, which is a glorious experience to behold, we can appreciate it all the more, as well as not be so disheartened when it doesn't last indefinitely. The good news is, it will return so long as we cultivate a life of contentment. And that is something we can do each and every day. All right. To visit the show notes for all these links and a list of 8 ways to shift your perspective from happiness to contentment, visit the simplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast 162. Now, before I get to today's petit plaisir, I want to share a couple of reviews from listeners, and thank you for taking the time to share with future listeners what this podcast is all about. So the first one comes from Rebecca Taylor. She writes, every episode of the podcast is a total delight. I want to thank you for taking the time to do this, for tuning in. I know it takes a little more time to write a comment, but it means the world as listeners and potential listeners are trying to check out, okay, what is this episode or is this podcast all about? I also want to give a shout out to a few reviews from the past that I have not yet said thank you to. The first one is the Thrifty Gardener, who wrote, I enjoy the weekly podcast and listen to them right away. I find her topics seasonal, inspirational, and uplifting. I too am a list person, so I appreciate Shannon's digestible categories from food, fashion, and making a home to plain good sense advice. You too will enjoy her podcast. My dad lives in Sisters, Oregon, so I love to be informed about what is going on for Bendites. I want to thank you, Thrifty Gardener, one of our local visitors to Bend, Oregon, for tuning in every week. I appreciate your time and interest, and I look forward to bringing you even more inspiration. And the last one that I want to share today is from Cancerian SLP. They write, The Simple Sophisticate is a weekly podcast that focuses on how to live one's best life. Reoccurring themes center around mindfulness, simple pleasures, fashion, and tips for overall self-care. Since beginning to listen in August 2014, from the beginning, so that's so exciting. Thank you so much for tuning in from the beginning. I can't believe we're going to be going on into our 4th year in September. Anyway, back to the comment. I have found that my quality of life has improved by taking to heart Miss Ables' tips and suggestions. The Simple Sophisticate is such a great podcast. I find myself looking forward to it each week and know that anyone who listens to it will soon be hooked too. Thank you very much. Thank you for the detailed review in the sense that sometimes people just don't know what this podcast is all about. We have a lot of episodes, and so they may tune into one that's all about fashion, but the next week it's about life advice. And so just letting them know that there's a variety of topics we talk about and what the overall goal is means so much, and it really does help not only in our rankings, but when people go search for podcasts in the self-help section, when this pops up, it's due to your reviews and comments. So for those of you who love this podcast, I really appreciate your time. We are an organic podcast, I guess you could say. It's cultivated. It's produced right from my home, in my office, just me behind the microphone, as you guys know, with a lot of fantastic interviewees that we've had over the years. And I have more to come. I'm so excited to share with you who we're going to have next month in August. So do stay tuned. And of course, Norman's here as backup, and Oscar too. But your support makes a big difference. So thank you for your time. But now we have a petit plaisir to get to, so let's do that. I'll be right back. All right, welcome back to this week's petit plaisir. And this one is all about the tomatoes. Those fresh tomatoes that are now just coming to market. There's so many of them. And you know the difference between the ones you buy in the store in the off season and the ones you pick up fresh just from the farm at the produce stand or at the farmer's market. They're so delicious and sweet and juicy, and you could eat them by themselves. But why not put cheese and a buttery crust underneath them? That's what we're going to do today in this tomato Gruyere tart. I was inspired from a Barefoot Contessa recipe recently on her new series, Cook Like a Pro, and she actually was inspired from a friend's recipe. And so I've taken it and shifted it a little bit with regards to adding a little simply luxurious touch. And that touch comes in the form of a very decadent Dijon mustard. So all you're really going to need are fresh herbs, tomatoes, and of course your ingredients for the crust. But you can also just go buy a pastry crust, a puff pastry dough at the supermarket. That's completely fine. It's going to work very well and make this an even simpler recipe. So once you've blind baked your crust, which by the way is a rustic crust, which is why I love this recipe. You don't have to worry about the sides falling down. You just roll out your crust, your dough. You make it a square, a rectangle, whatever size you want. Hey, if you just want it rustic, really rustic, don't shape it at all. Just roll it out and bake it. But the blind bake is easy when it's flat. All you have to do is place the second baking sheet on top of the crust. Voila, it stays put. It's perfect. After it comes out, you're going to let it cool. And then you paint your crust with your Dijon mustard. Now, I use Maille's mustard with Chardonnay and white truffle, and that extra element of flavor is just, it adds that extra pop. And any Dijon works well, so whatever you prefer. But that's where the fun comes in. That's where some more flavor comes in, right? Then get your Gruyere, your buttery Gruyere. Put more than you think you're going to need because it's just that good. A little bit of Parmesan. And then not just plain tomatoes. No. You're going to slice your tomatoes. And then you're going to top your tomatoes in a separate bowl with this dressing that involves basil, parsley, thyme, garlic, salt and pepper, and a little bit of olive oil. And you put those on the tomatoes. Yeah, that's a lot of good flavor there too. And then you arrange them neatly on your tomato tart. You, of course, have to top it with the leftover cheese, the Gruyere, and the Parm, and then you pop it in the oven, and that's it. That is it. It could be a meal all by itself. You could pair it with a side salad, and you might want to add a glass of wine, whatever you want. It's that simple, though. And the recipe is on the show notes, thesimplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast 162. I think you'll enjoy it. It was gone in 2 days in my household, and I'm the only one in my household. So I don't know if that's a good thing to admit, but it was really good. So I hope you've enjoyed this week's Petit Plaisir, where each week ideas are shared to make the everyday all the more enjoyable. Tune in at the end of each Monday's podcast where I'll recommend a book, a film, or a recipe. Anything that is a simple pleasure to satiate your sophisticated taste. Thank you for tuning in to the Simple Sophisticate podcast, where intelligent living is paired with signature style. For more ideas and inspiration throughout the week, stop by the blog, thesimplyluxuriouslife.com, or pick up the book, Choosing the Simply Luxurious Life, A Modern Woman's Guide. To stay caught up on the most recent podcasts, blog posts, and receive exclusive news as well as an extra dose of inspiration, subscribe to the Simply Luxurious Life's weekly newsletter, which arrives in your inbox each Friday to enjoy with a hot cup of tea or your morning coffee, just in time to jumpstart the weekend. Until next Monday, I'm your host, Shannon Ables. Bonne journée!